The galaxy was at war, and Earth was losing. Alien invaders, known as the Vraxians, had swept across countless worlds, conquering everything in their path. Earth's defenses, once mighty and proud, were no match for the advanced technology of these ruthless conquerors. The last human stronghold, a massive city named New Hope, was on the verge of falling. The streets, once full of life, were now empty and quiet, as most of the population had either been taken by the Vraxians or fled into the wilderness, hoping for a miracle. In the sky above, the alien ships loomed large. Their dark, metallic surfaces reflected the fading light of a dying sun. Massive warships hovered over the city, sending down beams of energy that reduced buildings to rubble. The Vraxians were ruthless, leaving nothing behind but destruction. They had no interest in negotiations or mercy. Their only goal was complete domination. Inside the last remaining human stronghold, the leaders of Earth's resistance sat around a table, their faces grim. They knew the situation was dire. General Sarah Winters, the leader of the resistance, looked around at the small group of survivors. Her mind raced as she thought of the countless battles fought and lost. Earth's military forces had been decimated, and the Vraxians had advanced too far to be stopped by any conventional means. The last hope for humanity seemed like a faint, distant dream. "We've lost," Sarah said softly, her voice heavy with defeat. "There's nothing more we can do. They've won." Her words hung in the air, as heavy as the silence that followed. The remaining soldiers, once brave and full of hope, were now just weary shadows of their former selves. They had fought until they had no strength left, and now, as the alien ships hovered above them, they knew their fight was nearing its end. Outside, the sounds of the battle raged on. The Vraxians had launched their final assault, sending wave after wave of troops into the city. Human soldiers, battered and bloodied, fought valiantly, but their numbers were too few. The city was being overrun, and there was no escape. The resistance was all but crushed, and Earth itself was on the brink of destruction. As the last city fell, the few remaining humans retreated into underground bunkers. The enemy's forces continued to advance, and Earth's once proud civilization was on the verge of extinction. General Winters and her team had nowhere left to go. The planet was falling, and there was no one left to help them. It was in this moment of despair, with the walls closing in and the future of humanity looking darker than ever, that something unexpected happened. Amid the chaos, a strange signal suddenly broke through the noise of the battle. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, but it grew stronger with each passing second. It was a signal from deep within human space, a signal that hadn't been heard in years. The humans in the bunker froze. The signal was encrypted, but it was unmistakably human. A call for help, but not just any call for help. A distress signal from a group of soldiers thought to be lost forever. General Winters quickly gathered a small team of technicians, and they worked to decode the message. The screen flickered as the message slowly came into focus. It wasn't a simple distress call. It was a plan, a map leading to a hidden base, far from the Vraxian reach. And it wasn't just a message of survival, it was a message of hope. This group of soldiers had been trained for a mission so secret, so dangerous, that even the highest military command had forgotten about them. They were humanity's last hope, hidden away and kept secret until now. These soldiers weren't ordinary. They were elite, equipped with the most advanced technology humanity had ever developed. They had been preparing for the final battle, the one that would decide the fate of Earth. But the Vraxians were closing in fast. The question was, could this group of soldiers make it in time to save humanity, or would they be too late? The signal wasn't just a message. It was a beacon calling out to the last remnants of humanity, offering a sliver of hope in a world that had nearly lost everything. General Winters stared at the screen, her heart pounding. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something stir inside her. Hope. It was a small spark, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, There was a chance to win this war. But as the signal continued to pulse, the aliens above them were growing more powerful, and the battle was far from over. Would humanity's last chance be enough to turn the tide, or would it be swallowed by the darkness? Only time would tell. The message from the distant group of soldiers spread like wildfire through the Resistance's remaining forces. It was a glimmer of hope, an unexpected twist in a war that seemed all but lost. General Winters and her team, still reeling from the despair of their situation, clung to the message as if it were the last thread holding them to reality. This wasn't just a signal, it was a lifeline. The soldiers were scattered across the galaxy, thought to be lost in an operation that had happened years ago. The message they had sent was not just a plea for help, but a beacon of survival. These soldiers had been waiting in the shadows, hidden away from the enemy's eyes, until now. Their mission was clear: to save humanity from destruction, even if it meant emerging from the depths of space when all seemed lost. General Winters couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion as she stared at the encrypted map on the screen. It was a plan, a route that led to a remote outpost far beyond the reach of the Vraxians. The soldiers, trained for the most difficult of missions, had been preparing for this moment, this final push to bring humanity back from the brink. Her mind raced. Could they make it? Could they, the last few survivors on Earth, somehow reach this outpost and connect with these soldiers in time to make a difference? Every part of her wanted to believe that this was their chance, their moment to fight back. But the reality was hard to ignore. The Vraxians were everywhere. They controlled the skies, the land, and the very future of Earth. To even think about turning the tide was almost too much to hope for. Her team worked quickly, coordinating with every remaining group of human fighters across the planet. They had to make a decision. Time was running out. The Vraxians had intensified their attacks, and it was only a matter of time before their forces broke through the last few defenses. There were no reinforcements, no armies left to turn the battle. It all rested on the shoulders of this group of soldiers, who had spent years preparing for this very moment, hidden away in the darkest corners of space. It wasn't long before a plan was devised. General Winters knew that their best chance of survival was to send a small team to reach the outpost. They had to navigate through enemy lines, across territories controlled by the Vraxians, all while avoiding detection. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was certain destruction. It was a gamble, one that they could only take because they had no other options. The soldiers who volunteered for the mission were chosen not just for their skill, but for their resilience. They were the best of the best, people who had fought in the most difficult battles and survived against all odds. Their hearts were full of courage, but even they knew how difficult this mission would be. They would be outnumbered, outgunned, and on a planet that was rapidly falling under the control of their enemies. The journey would take them across destroyed cities, through dangerous terrains, and past the very strongholds of the Vraxians. The stakes were impossibly high. Every decision, every move they made, could determine the fate of humanity. It wasn't just about survival. It was about changing the course of history, about proving that no matter how bleak the future seemed, there was always a way to fight back. As the team prepared for their journey, General Winters took one last look at the bunker that had been their home for so long. It was a place of refuge, but now it was all they had left. The final city was falling, and there would be no retreat if they failed. She knew that the fate of Earth lay in their hands, and she couldn't afford to fail. With a deep breath, she turned to her team. "We do this together," she said. "We fight for humanity, for every person who's ever believed in a better future. We're not giving up. Not now. Not ever." The group nodded, their faces filled with determination. There was no turning back now. They were humanity's last hope. As they set out, the sky above was filled with the distant rumble of the Vraxian warships. The sounds of battle echoed from far away. But in the midst of this chaos, a small flicker of hope began to shine. It was a distant, almost forgotten light, but it was enough to keep them moving forward. With every step, They knew that if they didn't succeed, Earth would fall. But if they did, they would change everything. The journey to the outpost was perilous, and every moment felt like an eternity. But the soldiers pressed on, driven by the belief that they were not alone. They were fighting for a future that could still be saved, for a world that deserved to live again. And with each passing moment, they drew closer to the soldiers who were waiting for them, ready to turn the tide of war. But the Vraxians were already aware. The battle for Earth was about to reach its most critical point, and the stakes had never been higher. Would the soldiers make it in time? Would humanity's last chance be enough to stop the Vraxians? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The fight for Earth had just begun. The journey had begun, and with each passing hour, the team moved deeper into enemy territory. The once bustling cities of Earth were now quiet, abandoned wastelands. The remnants of humanity had either fled or fallen, and the landscape was a grim reminder of the cost of this war. As they advanced through the ruins, the soldiers could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on them. They had been chosen for this task because they were the best, but even they knew that the odds of success were slim. The Vraxians were everywhere, and their presence loomed large over every step they took. The team had been given only a small window of time to reach the hidden outpost. The Vraxian forces were well aware of the Resistance's movement, and they were closing in. Their warships dominated the skies, and their scouts were scattered across the land. The soldiers had to be careful, moving in silence, avoiding detection at all costs. Every decision, every turn they made, could mean the difference between success and failure. As they navigated through the ruined cities, they encountered signs of the battle that had torn the planet apart. Burned-out vehicles lined the streets, remnants of the once great cities that had fallen. The team moved through these ruins, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. The air was thick with dust, and the sky above them was overcast, as if the planet itself was mourning the loss of its once thriving population. It was a strange feeling for the soldiers. They were used to combat, but not in a world that had already been defeated. They were walking through the aftermath of a war they hadn't started but now had to finish. As they moved forward, the terrain grew more challenging. The landscape was dotted with craters and broken structures, evidence of the devastating weapons the Vraxians had used in their assault. The team had to cross these areas carefully, always on alert for enemy patrols. Every time they thought they were safe, they had to remind themselves that the Vraxians were always watching, always hunting. Despite the danger, there was a sense of purpose among the soldiers. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something greater. They were fighting for the future of humanity. It wasn't just their lives on the line. It was the future of the planet itself. Each soldier understood the gravity of their mission. They were the last hope, and failure was not an option. As they neared the outskirts of the enemy's stronghold, the tension in the air grew thick. They could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The Vraxians had a strong presence in this area, and the team knew that they had to move quickly. They had no time to waste. The soldiers decided to split up into smaller groups to cover more ground and minimize the risk of being detected. The soldiers who went ahead were tasked with scouting out the area and identifying the best route to the hidden outpost. They had to move carefully, ensuring that no trace of their presence was left behind. The others followed at a distance, ready to provide support if needed. They moved like shadows, blending into the landscape, each step taken with the utmost caution. Hours passed, and the group began to close in on their destination. They had crossed several miles of dangerous terrain, evading enemy patrols and staying hidden in the shadows. The tension was palpable, but there was also a sense of anticipation. The outpost was close, and with it, the hope of turning the tide of the war. As they reached the final stretch, the soldiers gathered together, preparing for the final phase of their mission. They knew that the outpost would be heavily guarded, and they had to be prepared for anything. Their hearts were pounding in their chests, but they remained focused. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The soldiers had trained for years for a mission like this, and now it was time to see if they were truly ready. The leader of the group gave a signal, and the team began their final approach. The air was thick with anticipation as they moved in. They could see the distant outline of the outpost, barely visible against the darkening sky. It was surrounded by a large perimeter, guarded by watchtowers and patrols. The soldiers knew that they had to be smart if they were going to get inside without alerting the entire enemy force. They moved with precision, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Every step was calculated, every decision made with the utmost care. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The Vraxians were close, and if they were discovered now, it would be over. But despite the tension, there was a glimmer of hope in the soldiers' hearts. They were on the verge of something monumental. The outpost was within reach, and with it, the chance to finally make a stand against the Vraxians. As they neared the entrance, the soldiers held their breath. The final challenge awaited them. The fate of humanity rested in their hands, and they were determined not to let it slip away. The mission had only just begun, and they were ready to fight for the future of the planet, no matter what it took. The final approach to the outpost was a tense moment for the soldiers. They could see the watchtowers rising in the distance, tall and imposing, casting long shadows across the barren ground. The once vibrant landscape now seemed dead, as if the very planet itself had been drained of life. The soldiers moved with calculated precision, each one fully aware of the stakes. They were so close, yet every step brought them closer to potential danger. The outpost was humanity's last hope, a symbol of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The team had been trained for moments like this, but that didn't make the weight of the situation any easier to bear. General Winters had instilled in them a belief that they were the last bastion of hope for Earth, and they couldn't afford to fail. As they neared the perimeter, the leader signaled for everyone to stop. They needed to assess the area one last time before moving in. "Stay close. We'll split into pairs to cover more ground," the leader whispered. "Remember, we need to blend in, not stand out. Stay silent. Stay sharp." The soldiers nodded, understanding the importance of every move. As they broke off into pairs, each team took a different route, moving carefully and silently between shadows. The air was thick with tension, and each soldier could feel their heart beat louder in their chest. It was a strange mix of anticipation and fear, but the soldiers knew that fear could not dominate them. They had a mission, and they would see it through. The plan was simple but risky. They had to infiltrate the outpost and make contact with the soldiers hidden inside. The entrance was heavily guarded, but there were weak points in the perimeter that they could exploit. The soldiers had trained for months, simulating situations just like this, but nothing could prepare them for the uncertainty of the real thing. The Vraxian forces had eyes everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before they caught on to the human presence. As the pairs advanced, they kept their movements slow and deliberate. They had no room for error. Every sound, every shift in the air, could betray their position. The soldiers used their surroundings to their advantage, blending into the shadows and staying low to the ground. It was a delicate dance, one that required both patience and skill. Eventually, they reached the outer walls of the outpost, the first major obstacle between them and their goal. The walls were high, and the guards patrolled tirelessly, their eyes scanning every corner. The soldiers knew that their best chance of success was to get past the outer defenses without alerting the enemy. One of the soldiers, a young woman named Kara, had spotted an unguarded section of the wall. It was a small gap between two large storage containers, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Kara signaled to her partner, and they moved quickly, taking advantage of the momentary lapse in attention from the guards. As they squeezed through the gap, their hearts pounded. They were in. The outer defenses had been bypassed, but they still had a long way to go. The heart of the outpost was still a few hundred meters away, and every step could bring them closer to detection. They moved silently, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow for signs of danger. As they reached the main building, the soldiers could hear voices. It was faint, but there was no mistaking the sounds of the Vraxian patrols nearby. The team crouched low, using the darkness as their cover. They knew they couldn't risk being seen. Every second counted. The leader signaled for the group to halt. They would have to wait for the patrol to pass before continuing. The minutes felt like hours as they crouched, barely breathing, their muscles tense with anticipation. The faint sounds of the Vraxians grew louder, and the soldiers held their breath, willing themselves to remain unnoticed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the patrol passed. The soldiers exhaled quietly, their nerves frayed but intact. The moment had come. They could see the entrance to the building now, the door slightly ajar. They had made it this far. Now they had to push forward and find the soldiers hidden inside. They moved quickly, using their surroundings to stay concealed. The building was dark, the air musty and stale. The only sounds were the distant echoes of footsteps and the occasional creak of the structure. The soldiers reached the door, and one of them carefully pushed it open, just enough to slip inside. The tension was unbearable as they moved through the darkened hallway. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. They could sense that the soldiers within the outpost were just as eager to see them. But there was no time for hesitation. Every moment they spent inside the outpost brought them closer to discovery. They had to act quickly, make contact, and get the information they needed to turn the tide of the war. The soldiers split up once again, searching for the central command room where they believed the resistance forces were being held. It was a risk, but they had no choice. They had to make contact with the soldiers who were hiding in the heart of the outpost. If they succeeded, they would have the strength they needed to push back the Vraxians. If they failed, it would mean the end of humanity's fight. But the team was determined. They had come this far, and they would not turn back now. With every step, they felt the weight of the mission pressing down on them. The fate of Earth, the future of their people, was in their hands. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. The team had successfully infiltrated the outpost, but their journey was far from over. As they advanced deeper into the heart of the facility, they could feel the tension rising. Every room, every corridor seemed to hold the potential for danger. The darkness inside the building seemed to press in on them, making their every step feel like a calculated risk. They moved quickly, but carefully, using hand signals to communicate. Each soldier was fully aware of the stakes. If they were caught, not only would their mission fail, but they might also be the last hope for humanity. The pressure was immense, but there was something else driving them forward: determination. They knew they had to succeed. The team finally reached the central control room, the heart of the outpost. The door was slightly ajar, and they could hear muffled voices inside. It was a strange moment, standing on the edge of the unknown, knowing that everything they had worked for had led to this point. It wasn't just the fate of the outpost they were fighting for, it was the survival of humanity. The soldiers' resolve hardened. They couldn't afford to hesitate now. One by one, the soldiers entered the room, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The control room was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy with uncertainty. As they moved deeper into the space, they saw figures huddled near a console, busy at work. The soldiers were surprised to find that the room was not empty, but the people inside did not appear to be Vraxians. They were human, soldiers just like them. For a moment, the soldiers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The fear of detection was still fresh in their minds, and they couldn't afford to make any wrong moves. But the leader of the team, Sergeant Hayes, took a step forward and approached the group, his voice low but firm. "We're here to help," he said, his words filled with a quiet urgency. "We've come to turn the tide." The humans in the room looked up in surprise, their eyes wide with disbelief. They hadn't expected any reinforcements, certainly not from a group of soldiers who had come from deep behind enemy lines. They had thought they were the last ones left. But now As the realization settled in, they saw the hope in Sergeant Hayes' eyes. These soldiers had fought through impossible odds to get here, and they were offering a chance to win. A chance to fight back. As Sergeant Hayes spoke to the leader of the resistance group, the rest of the team stood watch, their senses alert for any signs of danger. The Vraxians could arrive at any moment, and they needed to move quickly. But in that brief moment, there was a sense of unity in the room, a fleeting sense that, despite the overwhelming odds, the human spirit could not be defeated. The leader of the resistance, a woman named Captain Marlowe, stepped forward to shake Sergeant Hayes' hand. "We've been waiting for this," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We've held on for as long as we could, but we've lost too many. We need your help to finish this." Sergeant Hayes nodded, his expression grim. "We're here to give you that chance, but we need to move fast. The Vraxians will be looking for us soon. We have one shot at this." Captain Marlowe nodded in agreement, and the room began to buzz with activity as the soldiers quickly formulated a plan. They had to act fast, using the information they had gathered and the resources inside the outpost. Together, they could make a stand against the overwhelming Vraxian forces that had ravaged their planet. But even as they prepared for their next steps, there was a sense of unease in the air. The Vraxians weren't known for their mercy, and the soldiers knew that any attempt to fight back would come at a great cost. There would be no easy victories, no simple solutions. The odds were still stacked against them, but the determination in their hearts outweighed the fear. The team began setting up their equipment, preparing for what would come next. They would have to be swift and precise in their actions. The soldiers who had arrived as reinforcements were ready for anything, but they also knew that they couldn't do it alone. They had to rely on the resistance fighters, who had been holding their ground for so long, to help them navigate the enemy stronghold. Sergeant Hayes and Captain Marlowe exchanged a brief glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They were about to face one of the toughest challenges of their lives, but they had something the Vraxians didn't: unity and the will to fight for what was right. With their plan in motion, the soldiers began moving into position. The control room became a hive of activity, with people working quickly to set up communications and coordinate their efforts. There was a shared sense of purpose that filled the room, a feeling that they were no longer alone in this fight. It was a rare and precious thing in a war that had stretched for so long. But the soldiers knew they couldn't afford to get complacent. As the plan took shape, they couldn't ignore the reality that danger was still very real. The Vraxians were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to crush any remaining human resistance. Time was running out, and the soldiers knew that if they were going to make a difference, they had to act now. The quiet hum of the machinery around them reminded them of how much they had already lost. The planet had been devastated, and the enemy was closing in, but there was still a chance. The team knew that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming what had been lost and ensuring that humanity had a future. They couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Every moment counted, and the next steps they took could change everything. As they readied themselves for the final push, they couldn't help but feel that the tide of the war was beginning to shift. The resistance was no longer alone in its struggle. Together, they would stand against the darkness. Together, they would fight for a future. The tension in the control room was palpable as the soldiers finalized their preparations. Each person in the room understood the weight of the task ahead, and as the plan took shape, the atmosphere was charged with a renewed sense of purpose. Outside, the dark sky stretched endlessly over the outpost, the stars barely visible through the haze of war. It was a quiet night, but the silence felt unnerving, like the calm before the storm. Sergeant Hayes stood at the center of the room, reviewing the final details of their plan. His eyes scanned the makeshift maps, tracing the paths they would take and the objectives they had to hit. His mind raced with possible outcomes, but there was one thing that remained constant. No matter how uncertain the future seemed, they had to succeed. They had no choice but to press forward. Captain Marlowe moved toward him, her expression determined but thoughtful. "We've done everything we can," she said quietly. "Now it's time for action." Hayes nodded, turning to face the others in the room. The resistance fighters, once weary and uncertain, were now infused with a new sense of resolve. They were ready to fight, to take back what had been stolen from them. The soldiers who had arrived to reinforce them were just as ready, having traveled across dangerous terrain to join the battle. Now it was all about executing the plan and getting through the next critical steps. Outside, the sound of distant activity drifted in through the cracked windows. The Vraxians were out there, somewhere, watching, waiting, but the humans had something they didn't: hope. And in this war, hope could be as powerful as any weapon. The soldiers understood that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about winning back their future. "Everyone knows their roles," Hayes said, raising his voice slightly to gather the attention of the room. "We move fast, stay silent, and keep our focus. This isn't just about taking the outpost. It's about sending a message. Humanity isn't done. We're still here, and we're going to fight until the very end." The soldiers exchanged nods, their expressions resolute. They had been through countless challenges, but this moment felt different. There was something about it, something about the unity they felt in this room, that made them believe they could overcome the impossible. As much as the Vraxians had taken from them, they had also given the humans something invaluable: the will to fight, the strength to keep going even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As the soldiers gathered their gear and checked their weapons, the quiet hum of the outpost seemed to grow louder. Every small sound, from the clinking of gear to the rustle of fabric, felt magnified in the stillness. Yet, amid the tension, there was a collective sense of calm. They had faced down worse odds before, and each time they had come out on top. This mission would be no different. They were fighting for more than just survival. They were fighting for their people, their families, and the future of Earth itself. The team moved out, slipping into the shadows, careful not to make a sound. Every step was deliberate, every move calculated. The plan had been set, but there were still unknowns. The Vraxians had many resources, and their forces were vast. But the soldiers weren't deterred. They were united in their mission, and nothing, not the enemy, not the terrain, not the odds, could take that away from them. As they navigated the winding corridors of the outpost, they could feel the weight of the mission bearing down on them. There were no second chances, no room for error. They had to succeed. Through the dimly lit hallways, they moved like shadows, blending seamlessly into the darkness. The occasional sound of footsteps echoed from far away, but they remained undetected. The soldiers knew that silence was their greatest ally. Every step brought them closer to their goal: to turn the tide, to push the Vraxians back and reclaim what had been lost. At the final checkpoint, they paused, taking a moment to catch their breath. The air was thick with anticipation. Everything they had fought for was within reach. The control room was just ahead, the key to unlocking the power they needed to shift the balance of the war. But there was no time to waste. They had to move. Sergeant Hayes gave a brief nod, signaling to the rest of the team. They knew what to do. Each member of the group positioned themselves around the door, preparing for what would come next. They couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. They had come this far, and failure was not an option. As the door slid open, the room beyond was revealed. Inside, the resistance forces had already begun to prepare their counteroffensive. The atmosphere was thick with purpose as the two groups came together, their shared goal now within reach. Captain Marlowe stepped forward to address the group. "This is it, the final push. Together, we can make this work. We will take back what's ours. For Earth, for our people." The soldiers exchanged determined glances, feeling a surge of energy at the words. Their plan was set in motion. Now it was time to act. They began their final assault, moving swiftly and efficiently, coordinating with precision as the outpost control systems powered up. The resistance fighters worked together with the new soldiers, combining their skills and knowledge. The teamwork was flawless, a testament to the months of preparation and the trust they had built along the way. Every action was part of a larger purpose. Every step brought them closer to their ultimate goal. Outside, the dark sky seemed to shimmer with possibility. The first rays of dawn began to break through, casting a faint light over the battlefield. It was a new day, and with it came a new hope, a hope that humanity, against all odds, might just win this fight. Inside the outpost, the control systems powered up, and a low hum filled the air. The soldiers exchanged glances. The tide was turning. They had fought their way into the heart of the enemy stronghold, and now it was their time to make a difference. As the Vraxians' forces began to feel the first ripple of change, they realized what the humans had known all along. No matter how dark the night, the dawn would always come.